Thanks, John. Thank you. Enough about table 7 over there. Well, everyone, throughout the morning, we've heard references to the changing demographics in the Greater Toronto Area. It started off with Kyle Dubas and just continued to roll along throughout the morning. Now we want to dig a little bit deeper into the details of exactly how this city is changing. And to do that, we want to introduce Dr. Marco Buono. And Marco is with Jumpstart, which many of you probably know is the Canadian Tire charity, which ensures that kids in need have equal access to sport and to physical activity. Marco?
All right. Thank you. Thank you. That was a great morning. That was a really good morning. And I'm going to pick up right where Laura left off. And that is to remind everyone that by design, our sports system is exclusionary. Let's not forget that. Okay? It's not a condemnation. What I want to present to you today is some facts and some resources and some hope with tangible things that you can do to change that reality. I didn't put this in here because Sean Fitzgerald is actually in the bill. I didn't know he was going to be here today, but I urge you to read his book before the lights go out. While it seems like a nice story about the Peterborough Petes, it's really something deeper than that. It is about the way our system has become exclusionary. And in my view, it's because we've lost sight of the ball. What's really important. The most important customer in sport is the participant. And I think we've lost sight of that. We heard a lot of that this morning, right? Moms and dads controlling the kids with magnet, devices under the ice surface and so on. It's very true. So let's level set and take a little bit of a look at what's going on in the sports system. We know, unfortunately, this data is the best data we have available. It goes back to 2010. But we know that there are declines in participation amongst children and youth. They're sustained. Some of you in your clubs are seeing what? Double-digit declines in registration year over year? I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case. There are a couple of important nuances to this information, though. One is that the declines are not just happening amongst kids and youth. There's a natural tendency to drop out of sport as we age. Now, some of you may be of the belief that teenagers who have a disproportionate drop-off as soon as they get to that tender age are doing it because of competing priorities, competing interests, digital revolution, keeping kids away from sport. Let's please not pretend that that's actually what's happening. Let's think of an alternative scenario, where because we haven't given kids what they're asking for in sport, as soon as they get to an age where they have the autonomy and independence to decide what they want to do, they drop out. And we don't want to confront the reality that that's what's happening, so instead we create this scenario where we think it's cell phones and video games that's preventing them from sustaining their interest. I can assure you, through the work we've done with over 2 million kids across the country in the 15 years that we've been running our charity at Canadian Tire, there's not a kid in the country who doesn't want to be active with their friends. There's not a kid in the country who doesn't want to give a peer a high five coming off the ice or off the pitch. That doesn't exist. Whether they're 10, whether they're 15, whether they're 20, they want to play. The other thing that's really important to tease out from this data that we have from 2010 is that having an adult mentor or a parent that's heavily involved in sport is a positive influence. Now, I don't want it to sound like I'm contradicting what you heard earlier about parents being overly engaged. I'm talking about representation here. I'm not talking about parents who control their kids' experience. I'm talking about parents that kids or adult mentors that kids can look up to, modeling the right behaviors that sustain their activity. You have 9 out of 10 kids whose parents are heavily involved in sport who stay involved in sport, compared to 2 out of 3 who don't have an adult mentor or parent involved. That's an important consideration. So I want to give you a couple of insights into two important populations that we've dealt with at Jumpstart. One is new Canadians, and the other is kids with disabilities, because they shed some light on things that we know about how to create truly inclusive environments for kids that's going to sustain their interests. And I want to close my short time with you today by giving you some examples of organizations that are doing this really well, and I want to encourage you to reach out to those organizations. So those are the two things I want you to promise me coming out of today's session, that you're going to think about this information and that you're going to reach out intentionally. So let's talk about new Canadians. Let's talk about immigration. We know that there's an increasing number of immigrants that are contributing to the growth of our country. Let's put the numbers into proportion. So last year, the population grew in Canada by about 540,000 people. 84% of that is new Canadians. That's 500,000 people that are coming to this country. And we're under the perception that they don't want to be involved in sport. But the reality is, we know that they do want to be involved in sport. The Institute of Canadian Citizenship surveys new Canadians as they come here and call this wonderful country home. And what we find is that their interest in participating in sport is very similar to the sports they participated in before they came to Canada, with very little variation. So it's not that new Canadians don't want to participate in sport, that there are certain sports that they will naturally gravitate towards because that's what's familiar. And almost half of them have kids who also want to participate in sport. So if there isn't any representation in your clubs based on this interest, we got to ask ourselves, why is that? Well, that's because we know that there are some significant barriers there as well, and I'm going to get to those in a minute. The other group I want to talk about is kids with disabilities. And why am I talking about this? Well, first of all, there's 1 million plus kids across the country who are on a spectrum of ability, from mild ability to not participate in a traditional format of a sport to severe disabilities that really hinder their participation in traditional ways of playing. Let's take this back to what the real end goal is. And it's not winning at sport. It's being intentional about the development of children, helping them achieve lifelong success through improved social and emotional learning through sport, improved academic performance through sport, improved mental health and resiliency through sport. If we take the long game into consideration, and here's another book I would urge you to think about, Simon Sinek's The Infinite Game. It's also the way successful corporations think, the long game. It's not about the quick win, it's about what the long-term outcome is. If we take that into consideration, we have a whole group of kids here who are disproportionately affected because more than other kids, children with disabilities really need us to help them achieve these outcomes. The challenge here is that we know there's a diverse population of participants out there that we can work with to sustain an interest we know is there in sport and physical activity participation. So diversity is a reality. But to tap into that, we need to be intentional. We need to make the choice to be inclusive. We can't just expect that because our clubs exist and all these people are coming into the country or all these kids have an interest in playing, that they're going to play. It doesn't work that way. Now, the good news is we know what to do to overcome that. So again, I go to New Canadians and the work that the Institute of Canadian Citizenship has done to articulate the barriers. Now, a lot of these barriers, they're common regardless of who we're talking about. Price to play, competing priorities, and time. That's common to every Canadian. But the specific barriers that prevent kids from new Canadian families to participating are also very, very well understood. There's the social isolation and the ostracization that comes with being new to a country. There are the lack of perceived opportunities, and so on and so forth. You see them listed there at the bottom. I don't expect you to remember this. I also don't expect you to remember all the resources that are available. You've heard lots of them today. You heard some from the Aspen Institute. You're going to hear some from me. But what I want you to feel comfortable knowing is that there are lots of amazing resources that are built on a lot of good understanding of how to overcome some of these barriers, really practical guidance. This one here from the Sport for Life Society that we helped support in 2017, a guide to introducing newcomers to your sport. And you heard earlier, one of our speakers, I think it may have been Stephen, who mentioned, put a child on your board. Well, yeah, put a child on your board. And please, let's be honest with ourselves. Let's not look and say, well, you know, our board policy says you got to do. Do we not write those policies? So let's think hard about the practical ways that and there are very many practical ways that we can be more inclusive and open and welcome all kinds of participants into our programs, but we have to be intentional. We have to want to do this. We have to have the courage to do this. And it's the same thing for kids with disabilities. We launched a really comprehensive program a couple of years ago that's having a tremendous amount of success. And while I don't expect a lot of your organizations to be able to deal with infrastructure issues that prevent kids with disabilities from accessing sport and recreation, or from being able to get the cost of adapted equipment down and affordable, I do expect all of us who work with kids to understand how to work with them really effectively. And to that end, I would point you to a resource, one of several that we've developed with the Respect Group, by the way, and with subject matter experts around the country, that help youth activity leaders and coaches become better youth activity leaders and coaches. And while this was designed specifically to help coaches work better with kids who are on the spectrum, quite frankly, as a parent who went through this and has 3 kids involved in various types of activities and sports, it made me a better person, made me a better coach, it made me a better role model for the kids that I work with. And so I would encourage you to think about the resources that are available. But listen, you don't have to do this alone, okay? You're gonna walk out of here today with a lot of enthusiasm, and that's really exciting. You're gonna take notes about all these amazing resources that exist. But what's more important is to know that there are organizations doing this work already. And if you're afraid, if you're scared, for whatever reason, you're worried about the change that this is going to create in your organizations, the cultural change that's required to stop keeping score, to keep kids on small-sided fields, to not tier your kids, know that this is already happening. There is a veritable cottage industry of sport that is happening outside of your associations, and in particular in hockey, where kids are playing outside of Hockey Canada sanctioned programs in very high-quality sport environments, and these programs are thriving. These are just 4 of the programs that we fund here in the GTA. They deal exclusively with either kids with disabilities or kids from new Canadian families. And we can't keep up with the demand. These programs are growing double digits year over year. They're looking to expand. And I can assure you that if any one of you would to reach out to any of these organizations here today, and many of them are in the room, they will happily partner with you to share best practices about how you can start to change in your organizations. And let me tell you, Heroes doesn't keep track of the score. They don't have tiering, they don't have a selection process, but they are attracting more kids than you are. And they are retaining them. They're retaining teens, they're retaining school-age children, and not just during their years of eligible participation, but they're coming back and they're asking to be coaches and activity leaders and administrators in those organizations. So when you're even mildly afraid of the change that's in front of you to be able to do this, think of the organizations that are thriving by accepting this and embracing this. So I'm out of time. It's a big topic, but I want to thank you for your attention. And again, the biggest take home I can ask you, please reach out to the organizations that are doing this and at least start a conversation about how you can embrace some of these principles and truly be intentional about including all participants for their own benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. We want to continue the conversation about the changing face of hockey and of our city and cities all across North America, because we can see those changes when we walk out in the streets, when we get in the streetcar, the subway, or we look at the faces in the stands, in particular at Raptors games. But it's not only happening here, it's happening all across North America and in every NHL city. So cue Kim Davis, this is where she comes in. She's an executive vice president at the NHL, and her job is to get her teams, those teams in the NHL, to do a better job of relating to diverse cultures. Kim? There you go.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Okay, that sounds better. I know we are on the back end, but I hope that that we have a little bit more energy left for what I know is going to be some real engaging conversation over the next couple of hours. And so I want to thank all of you at the beginning of this conversation for being engaged and being part of it, because I think what we're doing today is so important, and what the GTHL is undertaking is so critical to the future of the business of our sport. Last weekend at this same time, I was in Stockholm, Sweden for our NHL Global Games, and on Friday, before the games, the Swedish Hockey League and all of their federations had a business summit of about 120 leaders from across the country. And one of the topics that was top of mind for them was the issue of leadership and inclusion in the sport in Sweden. And I share that because you should know that this is something that is being talked about and being wrestled with across the globe. And it was exciting to see and to hear leaders talk about how inclusion and leadership was going to be a game changer for the sport in Sweden, and no doubt we understand that that is the case here in North America. So I want to thank Scott and Don and all of the leaders here today for bringing attention to this. I'm going to start by answering a question that many ask and many more want to know, and that is, how did a woman who had no background in history in hockey, did not play the game, end up in a senior role at the NHL? And so don't worry, I'm going to share that so that there's some context around this. And so what I would tell you is that after a 25-plus year background in history in investment banking with JP Morgan Chase and many predecessor organizations, I joined a CEO advisory firm that did a consulting project for the NHL. And in doing that and leading that consulting project for the NHL, I had the opportunity to work across the league and the clubs to interview people to help the league think about bringing more coherence to its youth hockey assets as well as its social assets. And after interviewing some 40 to 50 people, we were originally going to interview 15, and it just kept growing and growing and growing. And people were very open about what they saw as the opportunities and the challenges in our sport. What we learned was that the main issues really weren't about the coherence of social assets and youth hockey, but it was really about some organizational design issues, but more importantly, it was about culture. And many said that I should not bring the topic of culture to Commissioner Bettman because he didn't like culture. That was strange to me. And so as a consultant and having already been paid, it was easy to bring those issues. And so I shared with Gary and with Bill Daly my findings and all of the data. After a couple of months of talking about it and debating, those of you that know Commissioner Bettman, you know that he is not shy of debate. He suggested that maybe I should join the league to help the league think about who we are going to be in our next 100 years. If you think about the first 100 years being defined by speed and technology and innovation and the beauty of the sport, I would suggest that the next 100 years of our sport will be defined by culture and inclusion. And notice that I use the term inclusion and not diversity, because when I think about diversity, it really is about the mix. And we have the mix already. The mix is here. But inclusion is really about how do we make the mix work. And that is a choice that we have. And it's something that we have to be very intentional about, as we've heard so many times this morning. So with that as backdrop, let's move into some discussion about this. If I can get the... Okay, there we go. As we gathered today, I actually did a little research, and I'm mindful of an anniversary that's coming up next month, and in December, I understand it marks the 108th year since the founding of the GTHL, when Frank Smith founded it in 1911. I'm sure he couldn't have imagined that it would grow into the largest minor hockey league in the world, but he must have been thinking about the next generation of hockey because he was part of it. As I understand, he was only 17 years old when he founded it. So Frank really must have understood that in order to extend the sport to the next generation and to carry on everything that he loved about the sport when he was playing it, that he had to create a platform that reflected the traditions of Toronto hockey and the Toronto community and the trajectory for where it would go next. And it's because of that vision that the GTHL, I think, is poised to experience and has experienced the exponential growth that it has over the past century, which is to be applauded. But today, as we have heard everyone say thus far, we stand at a moment where it's time to think about the next generation of hockey, and it's time to carry the traditions, the best traditions of the sport in a way that fits the trajectory of where the hockey community and, frankly, where the world is going. When I joined the NHL 23 months ago, I had no background in hockey, but I did have a history. And it was a history that wasn't necessarily that positive. And it was a history that started 17 years ago when my son was 10 years old, and he was attending a very prestigious private school in Greenwich, Connecticut, where each kid was required to play hockey. And he was an excellent athlete and loved sport of all types and really gravitated and became very engaged with hockey until his first game with another team, where very quickly on the ice, one of the kids called him the N-word. And we were shocked, frankly, because in his 10 years, he had not experienced that, and for sure he had not experienced that in the world of sport, where you are supposed to feel free and to feel affirmed and to feel valued. And so my husband and I began to wonder what values were being taught by parents and teachers and coaches that would result in a 10-year-old child, another 10-year-old child, spewing something so hurtful. And as I think about that experience 15 years ago and I fast forward, I ask myself now as an executive in our sport, is there something in the culture that may be unintentionally affirming this? And it's something that I would ask you as we think about all of the information that we have heard and will hear, and as we continue to work through strategies to make sure that we have measurable ways to see how we impact the future of our sport here in Toronto. Is there something, unintentionally for sure, in the culture of our sport that may affirm some of the behavior that we have seen. Interestingly enough, since joining the league 23 months ago, I have had a number of individuals from different ethnic and racial and gender and sexual orientation and ableism backgrounds reach out to me to share their experiences, and they always start with their love for the sport. They always talk about first how much they love the sport, how much their children, their child loves the sport, and then typically it is followed by something that has made them feel not so welcomed by our sport. But as importantly, and I would say actually more importantly, I've had a number of white men in positions of power, parents and coaches, share their discomfort with some of the comments that they've heard their fellow coaches and their fellow parents and their friends, people that they socialize, say. And they are searching for the right language, and they are searching for the social bravery and the courage to confront their friends and their colleagues and their fellow coaches. And so the question is, how do we solve for both of those equations? Because that is a really, really important thing for us to understand from a data point, is that it's not just the experience that people who have been on the offending side have received, but those many in the room who just don't understand or don't have a familiarity with the language that is necessary in order to confront bad behavior or misinformation when we hear it. And so this is important, and it's something that I would ask you to think about. To grow our game and our business responsibly, and this is about growing our business at the end of the day, we have to accept and embrace how the world is changing. And you've heard that all morning and afternoon long. What we know to be true is that today's youth and their parents have different behaviors, different belief systems, and expectations of their sporting experiences. And we, again, have heard that supported by data all morning. The game itself is taking place in so many different forms, on different platforms. And what happens in the game can be shared across the world in mere seconds through the use of mobile devices. And that really is, quote, a game changer. And in countries where hockey is most popular, the demographic makeup is shifting. I talked about Sweden. Who would have imagined that the Swedish Hockey Federation would have invited me to come and talk about the issues of change, diversity, inclusion, and leadership? These are significant changes that are happening. But as we think about change and at any crucial pivot point in the whole notion of change, we have to reflect on our core values and our principles. And so you heard earlier, 2 years ago, and it was before I joined the league, the NHL embarked on the formation with 17 other governing bodies across North America on the formation of the Declaration of Principles. And those organizations came together to issue a document that really affirms that hockey is a powerful platform to build character and to build values and beliefs and to teach life skills and to improve our communities. And I think the Declaration of Principles has to be seen as more than just a vision statement. While it speaks to age-appropriate development and the importance of playing multiple sports and every child's physical, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual well-being, and all those things are important, it speaks to the values of inclusion and creating a welcoming environment that is fundamental to the growth of our sport and the sustainability of our sport. And I think that is powerful, and it's something that is actionable and measurable if all of us as stewards of the game take that position and take that work into the design and the destiny of the future of the GTHL. We have so many examples of organizations, of companies that have not done this, that have rested on their laurels and have not thought about and prepared for the future. Think about Blockbuster being crushed by Netflix. Think about Dell and how they were overridden by mobile devices. Think about Kodak and how they lost track of the digital age. And the list goes on and on and on and on. When I was in investment banking, we used to have a phrase that said, you change, you innovate, or you die. And I think that this is something that we can stand at the moment of thinking about the future through that lens. And all of these examples that I just outlined really point to how crucial it is that we all work together, that we as the stewards of the game build the most inclusive culture in youth sports, because it is the pipeline of the future of our sports, not only in terms of the kind of talent that we will attract, but also the fans that we will develop and the citizens that we will develop for not only Toronto, Canada, and the world. Today, you know, and again, we've heard all of these statistics, a third of NHL franchises are in markets where racial and ethnic groups make up more than half of the millennial population. Just let that sink in for a minute. A third of our NHL franchises, not will be, but currently today, are in markets where the racial and ethnic groups in those markets make up more than half the millennial population. Currently, as we've heard this morning, more than a fifth of Canadians are people of color, and these visible minorities are projected to be a third of the population in just the next 15 years. And nationwide, I heard a statistic that was stunning for me. Nationwide across Canada, an immigrant arrives every 1 minute, 52 seconds. It's pretty amazing. But you guys, you folks in the GTHL know this data well. You see it every day that Toronto is one of the most multicultural and multiracial cities in the world, and you are lauded for this. This is something that Canadians are proud of. But the share of Canadians who concurrently fall into what has traditionally been called the hockey family is decreasing and has decreased significantly. However, the share of Canadians, as you just saw from the data, that could potentially be attracted to our sport and thrive in our sport is larger than ever. And what a huge opportunity it is to use the sport of hockey as a catalyst to help build and grow strong and vibrant communities and to sustain the future of the sport. It's pretty amazing. These demographics are so crucial to the future of leagues like GTHL and, frankly, to professional leagues all the way up to the NHL. And just broadly across the world, this is important. The game's traditions, the attributes, and the values of this sport are so powerful, and when designed and promoted well, can really lead to growth. And for me, that's a huge opportunity for all of us and something that we should really be excited about. But to achieve this, we have to be conscious of how a tight-knit community like hockey can be perceived by those that stand on the outside of that hockey community. Those that stand on the outside of the community. And this goes beyond the barriers of cost and access to ice and equipment, even though those are major concerns, as we've heard all morning. But this goes beyond that. And this goes beyond time commitments and pressure and the race to be first and the notion of winning, even though all of those issues are critically important and they have to be addressed. This cuts to something that is far more fundamental and something that has not really been recognized and faced down in the past, and that is the cultural availability of the sport of hockey. We have to make kids and families feel like hockey is available to them. And let me share another personal experience about that. I grew up in Chicago in the 1960s, and my mom was a college professor at the University of Chicago. I was an outstanding speed skater, figure skater, and loved skating. And yet, we were in the Hyde Park area of Chicago, a very affluent family, And I never felt that the sport of hockey was something that was available to me, was accessible to me. Now, maybe in large part, and maybe in some part, that had to do with some preconceived notions that I had and the community had. But whatever the case, to miss an opportunity to engage a family like ours and the network that our family and our community represented was the missed opportunity for the beginning of creating that hockey community and hockey tribe that 50 years later could have really produced some pretty incredible players. Fast forward 30 years later, and you look at the experience that my son had, and we ask ourselves, can we do more to make our sport feel more welcoming? And that is the commitment that I think we all have to have as we think about the future of our sport and how we're going to advance that. 7 months ago, we engaged Spike Lee, the filmmaker, who also has a PR firm in New York, to do research and focus groups with multicultural millennials and Gen Zers. We did that work because we had done exhaustive research with millennials and Gen Zers across the league, but had never done a slice of that research to focus on the multicultural cohort within those two generational groups. And that was important because we know that for millennials and Gen Zers, multicultural is mainstream. In other words, over 50% of millennials and Gen Zers are multicultural. So understanding any unique attributes coming from those groups for multiculturals was really important. We did those focus groups in Toronto. We did them in New York, New Jersey, and on the West Coast in LA. And when we talk about cultural availability, what we're talking about is something that goes across sports platforms and really across athletes at all levels, from youth all the way up to professional levels. At the NHL, we are really committed in a very serious and intentional way to making sure that our game is welcoming to all cultural groups. That's not just in word, but also in deed. And to do that, we're now taking that research and that data that we got from those focus groups and understanding that we now have to begin to frame all of our outreach and our deep work, whether it is in marketing, in content, in how we communicate, in how we engage with groups from a youth sports, particularly how we engage with fans. All of that we are beginning to think about and look at through the lens of 4 dimensions, which we now are using the acronym CARE. Connection, aspiration, representation, and expression. And this came directly out of those focus groups that we engaged with the millennials and the Gen Zers. Let me define those dimensions for you a little more clearly. When we talk about connection, what we're talking about is our ability within our sport to flex and to shift and to be able to relate to the generational changes that are required for us to connect with what we know are future fans of our sport. And these generations don't just think about sport in a microcosm. They think about the intersection of sport with music, with fashion, with culture, with food. And so when we think about connection, we can't just think one-dimensionally about hockey, but we have to think about how we engage those audiences across all of those elements that are important to them. What's interesting about this is that the younger generations see the world differently, but we as the older generations are in the positions of power to actually make the change. And so we have to be the architects of the future of our sport if we are going to remain relevant. What's the Nike term? Just do it. I think whenever we talk to young people about the challenges that we perceive that we have in making our sport feel more welcoming, most of them just say they don't understand what the challenges are. Just do it. And so this concept of connection, I think, is important as we think about the integration of all of those things that are important to these generational groups. Aspiration, this is a really, really important one because this is where we have to show courageous leadership and social bravery on issues that impact society. We know that corporate responsibility and how we show up in the world and in society are really, really important to millennials and Gen Zers. And so when there's something that violates their values or their beliefs or stands in sharp contrast to their principles, they expect us to have a point of view. They expect us to stand up and to speak out. And sometimes that's hard and sometimes that's really, really tough. But if we are going to capture the hearts and minds of our future customer, we have to be able to create the aspiration for them to feel like we are in this for the long haul. Representation, whether we're talking about the representation in stadiums, with fans, with prospective fans, people like to see people that look like themselves. And the one experience that I've had in my career that was really defining for this, because I've always, in so many cases, particularly in corporate life, been the only one, either the only woman or the only person of color in the boardroom, and so I've sort of just gotten used to that. But I had an experience at Davos about 8 years ago that I think was a real defining moment for me. I got to Davos and I was checking in, and there were a number of colleagues, male colleagues, in the lobby of the hotel, and I had on sweats and sort of all my travel gear. And I was walking through, and nobody recognized me, and nobody spoke, and it was like, you know, I was sort of out of context, and people were sort of like, who is she and why is she here? And it was very demoralizing. And so I checked in, and there was a cocktail party that evening. And I checked in and was on my way up to the room, and I just sort of decided, you know what, I think I'm going to skip the cocktail party, because I just didn't have the energy to have to create an environment that was welcoming for me. And so I got to my room, and I saw this beautiful bouquet of flowers in the room, and I figured the host had sent them. And I opened the note, and there was a note in there that said, I know something has already happened that makes you feel like you shouldn't be there. And I'm telling you, put on your baddest red bottom pumps and your baddest suit and get your ass down there and get in the game. And it was a note from my husband. And he just knew that that experience was going to happen. And so representation counts. And it's not just for our kids, it's for every single one of us. And so building a pipeline of diverse talent that makes people feel included has to be part of our responsibility as we think about how we are going to grow our sport. And then finally, expression, which is such an important aspect of finding the balance between the traditions of our sport and allowing people to express themselves authentically, allowing players and people to show their individuality in a way that is not judged, and that we don't have stereotypes based on our lack of exposure or our lack of experience, and that we allow people that look or speak or act different than ourselves to feel welcomed in our sport, and we suspend judgment around that. So this concept of care, connection, aspiration, representation, and expression is a framework and a model that we are absolutely focused on making sure that we integrate and weave into every aspect of how we think about creating that environment where people can feel welcomed. And these are concepts that our sport, I believe, has to commit to. And whether we use the CARE acronym or something else, what's underlying that acronym, I think, is so critical to how we have to think about the future of our sport. Do the research. We have so much data already. Listen to the voice of the customer, who are the young people, the people that are going to be the consumers of our sport in the future, the next generation. And we have to do just like we do in a corporate context. We do the research, we understand the voice of the customer, and then we adjust and we shift our products and our services to respond to the customer. Regardless of the mosaic, and that mosaic changes depending on where you are in North America or even in the world, wherever you are in different parts of North America, there are many steps that we can take, very concrete steps, to help us build a culture and an environment that is inclusive and welcoming. And to capitalize on the opportunities that exist, we do have to exhibit the social bravery. We have to combat negative perceptions and stereotypes and some realities that exist in our game. And we have to face them down and be honest and open and having those difficult conversations about those things. I think it's important for us to move forward with more intentionality about addressing some of these issues, the racial issues, the xenophobic issues, the homophobic issues, the gender inequality issues. We have to really think in a very intentional way about what is it that we might be doing that might be somehow or another affirming some of this, and we have to stop doing it. We have to look at all of the issues that are happening at the youth hockey level and at the amateur hockey level that involve these derogatory kinds of actions, and we have to put a stake in the ground that we will not tolerate this. If we are going to really create the credibility that we need to create with new audiences, because people look at not your words but our actions, we have to create the trust. And that trust is created by us taking the responsibility and having people believe that we are sincere and legitimate about wanting to learn and to change. I think one of the ways in which we begin to do that, it's not the panacea, but it is absolutely an important step in the right direction, is with formal rules and procedures that guide the behaviors of our players. You've seen probably earlier this month that USA Hockey announced a stronger penalty for stances of hateful and bigoted language. Any player found using that language either before, during, or after a game will receive an automatic match penalty. And while we understand, again, that stricter penalties alone will not eliminate every stance of a bigoted language, we know that fundamentally, when you put those kinds of policies in place, that it eliminates any confusion about whether this kind of behavior and this kind of language is acceptable or not. And so there are many steps that we are taking in addition to the policy and the procedure work to help create an environment where people can have authentic conversations and begin to speak about those uncomfortable issues. And one is we have started doing town halls around uncomfortable conversations. We did one that was hosted by the New Jersey Devils this past June, where we had parents who had experienced racial slurs, whose children had experienced racial slurs, come and speak to coaches and those volunteers in positions of power and other parents about what the impact of that is on a child so that people could actually have empathy. And we had over 100 leaders in the room talking about those conversations and people asking questions that were very uncomfortable. And, you know, nobody likes to look like they are ignorant or are unknowing, but it won't be until we are comfortable in having the uncomfortable conversations that we are really going to make legitimate progress on these kinds of issues. Another thing that we are doing in a much more intentional and focused way is understanding that who we are is really about the stories that we tell and the content that we highlight all across the hockey community. And so while we have had the Hockey is for Everyone effort underway for a number of years, we have become much more focused on and intentional in using that Hockey is for Everyone campaign as a way to just really highlight the natural inflection points that exist throughout the year for different underrepresented groups, but that the issues surrounding these groups and our outreach to these groups should be year-round and should be woven into the natural fabric of how we communicate and how we deliver content and how we develop content year-round. Some of the natural inflection points that we are now highlighting in a very intentional way and going into communities and being good listeners and learners, that's another thing that's really important for us to do. You know, typically, as you look around this room, we have captains of industry, CEOs, people that are in positions of power, and we know that people in these kinds of positions, we're used to getting things done and telling people how to get things done and solving problems. And that's not to say that that's not really, really important. But part of this is also understanding that maybe in some of these areas, this is new territory, and that we need to be better listeners and learners. That maybe we don't have all of the answers, and maybe the answers are out there for those to share with us. And sometimes just being a good listener is part of what change is going to really affect. So these natural inflection points are really important, but I think the most important thing that we've done in the past year is that we've gone into different communities and we've asked those communities to tell us what would make them feel more engaged and more welcome. And the feedback that we have gotten has been simple. It's been, be consistent, be authentic, don't treat us like a flavor of the month, don't act like this is something that is going to be solved overnight. If you don't see change in 6 months, 12 months, don't abandon the effort. This is a journey, it's not an event. And so these are all the things that we have to think about. The work that we're doing now, many of us may not be in the sport when we actually see the true impact of this change. This is work that we are going to really see substantive change probably the next 15 or 20 years. And so the question is, do we have the staying power and do we have the courageous leadership to work now for something that may happen well after we are here, well after we're involved with the sport? And I say the answer to that has to be yes. I don't have to talk much about the issues of women and girls in the sport in Canada because you well understand and know and have in many ways been leaders in the issues around women and girls. But the NHL's female fan base, both in the U.S. and in Canada, is roughly around 40%. And I think what's important about the engagement of women and girls is that this is not just about the creation of fans and future players. This is about citizens, but this is about the future leadership. For example, in the United States, there are more female CMOs and CFOs that have emerged in the past 10 years than the past 100 years across North America. That's amazing when you think about the people that are going to be in positions of making decisions about sponsorships in the future. Many are going to be women. So as we think about the future revenue of our sport, women are going to hold the keys to a lot of the future of how our sport is going to be financed and funded. We're proud of the work that we're doing. We were proud of the work that we were doing, but we knew that we needed to do more. And so in March of this year, we convened a female advisory board made up of former Olympians and women players and women who are in the sport of hockey to help us think through in a much more, again, intentional way how we can make the sport more engaging for girls and for women. And one of the first acts that came out of that female advisory board was the formation and creation under Rob Knezerit's group of a female ambassador program which is a pot of money that has been set aside by the NHL and the NHLPA to help women who are mentors and role models for girls in markets where there may not be any female coaches or role models in those markets where we are building girls hockey, to be able to go in and to be paid a wage comparable to the men who are alum who go into those markets, so that they can be the inspiration and the connection and the representation for those girls. And I think what's amazing about that small act alone, which that fund was put in place in June of this year, we had, at the beginning of the season, 6 of our NHL clubs that had girls-only hockey clubs. After 6 months of just having that ambassador program, 24 of the 31 clubs now have girls-only programs. So it really shows you what can happen when you are intentional about your efforts. And so I would encourage each of you, as you think about the growing female population in Canada and the influencers who are women, to think, again, in a much more detailed way about how you can do more engaging and be more thoughtful. Sometimes it can feel overwhelming when you think about all of the kinds of things that we've talked about today and before today, and the kind of change that's going to be necessary for us to really see the impact that I think we all dream of. But again, this is a journey. It's not an event. And I think one of the things that makes youth hockey so special is that there's these generational memories that people just cherish and they talk about. And when the sport is done right and the community rallies around itself and its players, it's such a tight-knit community that stays with people for the rest of their lives. And I think what we have to simply get back to is, how do we share those oral histories with people who don't necessarily have that history and that kind of community? And you'd be surprised how people will feel so engaged when they hear those stories and they can envision themselves being part of that. So how do we continue to ensure that we make children and families feel like the sport of hockey is for them? I think it boils down to something a term that I came up with a dear friend of mine some years ago, professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder by the name of Dr. Stephanie Johnson, who's a professor of leadership there. She and I co-authored an article that was published in the Harvard Business Review, and I would ask you to, if you have a moment, to Google it and read the full article. Stephanie Johnson and Kim Davis. The article was called Promotion Focused versus Prevention Focused. And the article was based on interviews that we did with CEOs across the United States, CEOs who had over 40% of their board seats represented by women, and CEOs that had under 40% of their board seats represented by women. And in talking to and interviewing those CEOs, what we ultimately concluded was that there are 2 types of leaders that focus on this kind of change. In this case, it was gender equality on corporate boards. And we termed it prevention-focused and promotion-focused. And when we talk about prevention-focused, being a prevention-focused leader, that's a leader that stays in the safe zone. It's the more conservative and sort of looking at the world through what I call the lens of protection. How can I protect what I currently have? Versus that promotion-focused leader who looks at the world through the lens of opportunity, the future. What can it be? How can I take what might feel like some risk, but actually when you analyze it, it's not risk at all? And it was very, very interesting to see and to hear how the prevention-focused versus the promotion-focused leader talked about today and the future. And my question for each one of us in this room is, who are you? Are you a prevention-focused leader, or are you a promotion-focused leader? I'm confident that everyone here today is committed to the task ahead of us. I don't think that's the issue. I'm also confident from what I've heard all morning that the GTHL can merge the rich traditions of the GTHL with the new trajectory of our time. And that is probably something much like Frank Smith set out to do in his time. And so another question for us to ask ourselves as we work through this is, what is it that we're scared of? What is it that we're scared of? And whatever that is, we should address it, we should talk about it openly, and we should eradicate it, because the future of our sport and the future of our kids are waiting for our leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Well, Kim has given us certainly a lot to think about, to talk about. So cue John and Ekta.
Alrighty. So we're getting right to it with this round. We're moving right to the one question for harvesting your themes. And reminder again, themes go on orange, questions on pink. So if you would, please take 10 minutes to discuss this one key question. Based on what you just heard from Kim, what are some specific ways you're envisioning to expand who is involved in hockey? The words you don't see on the slide, but that we heard from Kim, are around those dual paths of how do we kind of balance the respect for the traditional while still creating and maintaining a welcoming atmosphere for the so-called non-traditional participants, or those that we're trying to engage with and use hockey as a catalyst to bring them along on the journey. So while standing in that necessary tension of traditional and non-traditional, what are some specific ways that we can still expand who is involved in the hockey experience? So 10 minutes, and when you're ready, please hold up your sheets. You know the drill, and we'll come around. Thank you. Take it away.